He sat alone in his office long after the Parliament lights had dimmed, the echo of his own speeches still ringing in his head. For years, he had stood at that podium, under the bright TV cameras, declaring that Islam was a threat to everything his country held dear. He had campaigned on closing mosques, banning the hijab, and stopping immigration from Muslim countries. Every time he attacked Islam, his popularity increased. Newspapers quoted him, talk shows invited him, and supporters wrote to him calling him a hero who was saving Europe. Yet, in the silence of his office, there was a restlessness he could not drown out. He had built his political identity on an enemy he knew only from headlines and edited news clips. Images of explosions, angry faces, flags burning. That was all he thought Islam was. Still, something inside him whispered, "Is this the whole truth?" One day, during a strategy meeting, he announced his next big project. He would write a book. Not just any book, but what he imagined would be the ultimate intellectual attack on Islam. It would be his legacy, carefully argued, full of references, impossible to ignore. His advisors loved the idea. They suggested sources, books written by critics of Islam, reports about terrorism, articles by former extremists. As the list of anti-Islam references grew, one of his senior aides, almost as an afterthought, said, "If you really want to be taken seriously, you should at least read the Qur'an yourself. People will ask you, and you need to say you've read it." He disliked the suggestion. The last thing he wanted was to spend hours reading what he believed was a dangerous, backward text. But the political logic was sound. If he could say, "I have read your holy book, and here is why it is wrong," his arguments would carry more weight. So, late one evening, he ordered a translated copy of the Qur'an online. When it arrived, he left it on his desk for days, almost irritated by its presence, as if the green cover itself were an intruder. Finally, one night when sleep would not come, he opened it with the cold intention of collecting ammunition. He expected to find open calls for senseless violence, pages of primitive rules and contradictions. Instead, the first words that confronted him were about mercy and compassion. Verses spoke of a God who was one, without partner, who knew the secrets of every heart. The Qur'an addressed him directly, as if it were aware of his doubts and arrogance. It challenged him to think, to reflect, to look at the sky, the earth, his own soul. He frowned and turned the pages. He found verses that commanded justice even towards those you dislike, warning, "Do not let the hatred of a people cause you to be unjust." It was a shock to read this in a book he had labeled a source of hatred. He stumbled upon words that declared there was no compulsion in religion, that guidance must be accepted freely. This sounded nothing like the forced conversions and oppression he had always associated with Islam. At first, he tried to brush off these verses as exceptions, unusual lines in an otherwise terrible book. But the more he read, the more he realized that justice, mercy, and accountability before one God were not marginal ideas. They formed the core of the text. Curiosity began to push aside contempt. The politician who had built his career on fear started staying up later and later in the glow of his desk lamp, turning page after page. He wrote notes in the margins, not yet of agreement, but of surprise and confusion. The more he searched for clear evidence that Islam was inherently violent, the more he found detailed rules about war and peace that were far more restricted and moral than the simplistic slogans he had used in his speeches. His planned chapters started to shift. The introduction he had drafted, full of aggressive claims about Islam's obvious barbarity, no longer matched what he was discovering. He told himself he was only playing the devil's advocate, testing the religion from the inside so he could attack it more effectively. But his private questions grew louder. Why had no one told him about this side of Islam? Why had he never met these verses in the news? He began sneaking into Islamic bookstores, careful not to be recognized. He bought biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, books on Islamic law, and even works of history written by non-Muslims. He read about a man who forgave his enemies when he had full power to punish them, about treaties that protected religious minorities, about a civilization that had, at times, led the world in science and philosophy. His mind fought back. He reminded himself that he was a child of European Enlightenment, secular, rational, modern. He had already chosen his side. And yet, the logic of pure monotheism, of worshipping one unseen creator without intermediaries, began to satisfy a part of him he had ignored for years. He started comparing it with his own vague cultural Christianity, which for him had always been more tradition than conviction. Late at night, he would close the Qur'an and stare at his reflection in the dark window. "What are you doing?" he would ask himself. "You are feeding the very thing you set out to destroy." But another, quieter voice answered, "No, you are feeding a hunger you never admitted you had." Months passed. The manuscript grew. What was supposed to be a cold attack on Islam slowly turned into a document of his unforeseen journey. He wrote about stereotypes, misunderstandings, and his own past anger. In one chapter, he carefully listed arguments against Islam he had repeated for years, only to refute them one by one using sources he never would have trusted before. When he realized what he had written, he felt both fear and clarity. If he published the book as it now stood, he would not be known as the man who exposed Islam, but as the one who admitted he had been wrong about it. Colleagues would turn on him. Voters would desert him. His party would call him a traitor. If he rewrote the book to fit his old narrative, he would be lying openly, not just to others, but to himself. This inner conflict followed him everywhere, in committee meetings, in interviews, in public debates. Standing before cameras, repeating his usual anti-Islam talking points, he felt the falsehood of his own words like a stone in his throat. He still delivered them, but now each sentence tasted bitter. One winter evening, long after his staff had gone home, he sat alone with the nearly finished manuscript open on his screen. Outside, snowflakes fell silently over the Capitol. Inside, pages and pages bore witness to a war inside one man's soul. He scrolled through his own words, heart-pounding, realizing that the man who had begun this project no longer existed. Exhausted, he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and whispered into the darkness of the room, not even sure to whom he was speaking. For the first time, he addressed the one he had been reading about. "If you are real, if you are as just and as merciful as this book says, then you know everything I have done, everything I have said about this religion. You know my pride, my fear, my hatred. I don't know how to fix any of this, but I cannot deny what I have found." Tears surprised him. They were not dramatic sobs, just a quiet, steady flow he had no strength left to stop. Memories flashed before him, his speeches, the protests his words had sparked, the families who had felt unwelcome in his country because of him. The weight of it all pressed heavily on his chest. On his desk lay the translated Qur'an, open at a page he had underlined earlier. His eyes fell on words about God being near, answering the call of the one who calls upon him. Without fully understanding the ritual language of Muslims, he knew what his heart wanted to say. His lips trembled as he spoke, slowly, in a language that was not his own, the testimony he had read about many times by now. that there is no God worthy of worship except Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger. When he finished, the room was as silent as before, yet for him, everything had changed. It was as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted, not to make him fall, but to finally give him something solid to stand on. He sat there for a long time, unsure of what to do next. No journalists knew. No headlines would appear the next morning announcing his transformation. At that moment, it was just a man and his Lord, after years of running in the opposite direction. In the days that followed, he moved carefully, almost secretly. He visited a small mosque outside his district, far from his voters and cameras. An elderly imam greeted him with a gentle smile, not recognizing who he was at first. When the politician, voice shaking, explained his story, the imam simply said, "You are welcome. You have come home." There were no accusations, no lectures about his past hatred, just an invitation to start again. Eventually, he knew he could not remain two people forever, the public enemy of Islam and the private believer. There came a day when he stood, not in Parliament, but before a row of microphones, the same media ready to record every word. This time, his speech was not about borders or bans. It was about truth and the price of following it. He announced that he was stepping down from his party and that he had embraced the very faith he once worked to ban. The reaction was as fierce as he had expected: outrage, mockery, disbelief. Old allies turned away. Some called him mentally ill, others a traitor. But beneath the noise, there were also messages from strangers who said his journey had given them hope. In the quiet that followed the storm, he walked down a street where, a few years earlier, he had marched in protest against a mosque. Now, he passed by that same building, not as an opponent, but as a humble worshipper slipping inside for prayer. The man who had once defined himself by what he hated was learning, step by step, to define himself by the one he now loved and worshipped.